Welcome to our very first episode of Building Your Theology. This week we talk about God. Talking about God can be difficult for some of us. The word itself comes with baggage. But a lot of that baggage is wrapped up in our understanding of God, or maybe even our misunderstanding of God. For many of us, we ditched our ideas of God as king or father, or as some being living up in the clouds with white hair and beard, flowing robes. There came a time when our understanding just didn't work. And so in this first of a series of Building Your Theology, we tackle God. Metaphorically, of course. So set aside your prejudices about God, throw out the box that you've put God in, and wipe the slate clean, and let's construct an understanding of God that works. Today we'll put forth some basic ideas. We'll talk about some old white theologians, and hopefully you'll begin to form an understanding of God that works for you. So we begin with some theological perspectives. And we have to start somewhere, and fortunately there are people a lot smarter than me who have tried to understand God. Did they get it right? I have no idea. God is a mystery, unknowable. Words are inadequate to describe God. But we try anyway. And we find that we are forced into using analogy and metaphor, or perhaps we end up in a place where it's easier to talk about what God isn't rather than what God is. But today, each of the men that we'll talk about, although perhaps smarter than me or maybe even smarter than you, each of them is just like us, and in that they just want to know God. So you may ask, how can we build our own theology? Because like the theologian, we just want to know God. And their experience of God is no more or less valid than our own. At the end of the day, none of us can hold the absolute truth of who and what God is. Only Jesus had that privilege. So let's jump in. The first theologian that we talk about is Augustine of Hippo. And I'm going to share a quote to begin. Since nothing that is could exist without you, you must in some way be in all that is. Augustine wrote this in Confessions. And as we read further, we get a sense of how Augustine may have viewed God. An omnipresent God. God in me and I in God. God always with me, such that I don't have to go anywhere to seek God, because God can be found in me and with me. He has said, heaven and earth do I fill. Augustine's experience of God was a God incarnate. The world, God's body, and we all a part of it. That's a metaphor that Sally McFague uses. She's a contemporary theologian, and she posits that the earth is God's chosen embodiment, a body that contains all other bodies. But Augustine also acknowledged that speaking of God was attempting to speak of things that cannot be uttered. To Augustine, God is a mystery for which our language is insufficient to explain. Next, we take a look at Anselm of Canterbury. Anselm was known for his ontological argument for the existence of God. And through that argument, we get a sense of Anselm's experience of God. Anselm wrote, "A being than which no greater can be conceived." Anselm, you see, described God as supreme in all things. For example, if God is good, then God is supremely good. If God is just, then God is supremely just. So in whatever nature we ascribe to God, then God must be the maximum of that nature. Anselm also points out that if, for example, a man is just, that man possesses justness, while God is justness. Next, we look at Thomas Aquinas. Thomas's 5 ways argument can be summarized as God is the first mover, the first cause, the necessary being, the highest good, and the one who shapes the universe. Thomas also viewed God as two processions. He said that there were two processions in God. There's the procession of the Word, Jesus. Jesus is the Word of God whose origins are in God. And there's also the procession of the Spirit, which is regularly described in the biblical text as issuing from God, sometimes in the form of breath or wind, or as divine love or as divine wisdom. But Thomas also recognized how inadequate our own words can be when talking about God. He understands that when we describe God, we're using words that apply to the characteristics of God's creatures. And so all we can do is derive this parallel between creator and creature. But these metaphors, Thomas acknowledged, are not sufficient to explain God. Similar to Anselm, Thomas says that when we call God good, we don't just mean that God possesses or causes goodness, but that God is the perfect representation of all that is good. Next, we look at Karl Barth. And Barth, when posed with the question, who and what is God, thought that the better question was, who and what is God in Jesus? For Barth, it is God's power, God's transcendence, that gives us the person of Jesus. It's God's power that allows God to subordinate God's self into the person of Jesus. And then it is through Jesus that we can see a little of who and what God is. But all of this, according to Barth, points to the inclusion of humanity in the deity of God. And then finally, we arrive at Tillich. And he is by no means the last word. But Tillich poses some interesting ideas about God. You see, Tillich believed that God was not a being, but being itself. He referred to God as the ground of being. And in this universe, or this world of existence, where we exist, the world exists, where there is being, well, Tillich thought that since we cannot deny this existence, this beingness, we can't deny that there is being, and therefore there must be a power of being. He saw God as the ground upon which all things exist. And if that's the case, then God has to precede being itself. And then God is then manifested in the structure of beings. And so we have this idea that God is not so much a being as being itself. All things spring from God. They spring from that ground of being. So who or what is God? We've got a lot of different perspectives. And from these perspectives, we can begin to form an understanding. We can test these ideas to see what works for us, what matches our individual experiences of God. Because remember, experience is what's most important here. Our understanding of God is not going to resonate with us. It's not going to be ours unless it's based in our experience. So we can begin to test our own ideas. For example, if we believe God to be loving, well, what does it mean for God to be love? What do we learn of God through the person of Jesus? Can we really know God? Or is God too big of a mystery, unknowable, beyond explanation? Just remember that your experience of God, your idea of who and what God is, it's valid. It is as valid as any of the ideas that I've presented to you today. So in all of these ideas presented by theologians, and even in our individual experiences of God, we always, and they always, understand God in terms of imminence and transcendence. Meaning that we look at God as either somewhere out there, being transcendent, all-powerful, omniscient, beyond our understanding, beyond description. And yet, at the same time, God is present, here with us, in the person of Jesus, capable of understanding our joys and our suffering because of Jesus. Present, imminent, in the spirit that Jesus left with us. And so when we describe God, when we describe our experience of God, we are talking about God's transcendence and God's imminence. And finally, one of the other things that we often talk about is the image of God. Imago Dei. And we can learn something about God through our understanding of what it means to be created in the image of God. You know, my very childish view of this was always that somehow we physically looked like God. But, you know, that view limits God and my understanding of humanity. I mean, if we are created in the image of God, then all of humanity is in the image of God. All races, all ethnicities, all physical expressions, all mental states, all genders and gender expressions, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, all creatures, all of creation, created in the image of God, present in the image of God. But there's even more to this idea of being created in the image of God. Theologians tell us that it may mean that we possess reason and we exercise free will like God. Or like God, we have dominion over the world. Or that we are capable of a conscious relationship with God, just as God is capable of a relationship with us. Or perhaps our relationships with one another resemble the relationship of love between the persons of the Trinity. What do you think? What does it mean to be created in the image of God? There's a lot to think about when thinking about God. And I, for one, am continually developing my understanding, or maybe I should say my lack of understanding of God. I'm often most content with accepting that I cannot know who or what God is. I cannot find words to describe God. I'm content knowing that it's not important for me to fully understand God, but to know that God understands me. So, you may not come away from this with an understanding of God, but hopefully you have a place to begin. And hopefully you have the encouragement and the confidence to know that your understanding of God is as good as mine. It's maybe better than mine. Your understanding of God is as valid as any theologian. Because we're all on this path, we're all on this journey to know God. Before we go, I'd like to refer to you some amazing women in theology. Sally McFague was mentioned earlier on in this presentation. She wrote a wonderful book called Metaphorical Theology. Then there is Dorothy Sola. She wrote a book called Thinking About God. Both of these books were very helpful to me in my understanding of God, or as I said, my lack of understanding of God. And then finally, there is a wonderful New York Times editorial interview done by Nicholas Kristof with Serene Jones. Serene Jones is the president of the Union Theological Seminary in New York, and she's also the author of many books, and she just has a wonderful perspective on theology, and I think you will enjoy that article, and I think it will challenge you to rethink some of what you believe or may not believe. And so I offer those to you, and I hope that you will take some time to look into other views on theology and views on God. So that's the end of our episode on God. Please join me again next week as we continue this series on building your theology.